My son took me in for my money. When I refused, he charged me. Rent. So I bought the house. At dinner, my own son stood up, looked me in the eye, and said in front of his wife and child, "No rent, no stay." I didn't cry. I didn't fight. But the next morning, I made one phone call that would change everything. And when I walked back through that door, not as a guest, but as the owner, they finally saw who I really was. Let me tell you how I went from unwanted to unforgettable. The house was too quiet these days. Even the soft creak of the rocking chair seemed loud, intrusive, like it didn't belong in the silence anymore. Anna sat by the window in that old oak rocker, her fingertips gently tracing the worn grooves along the armrest. George had carved those during their first winter in the house, back when they still laughed at midnight and danced barefoot in the kitchen just because. He'd told her it was so you'd always have a place to wait for me. She had. She always did. Outside the garden, the rose bushes were in bloom, lavish, blushing, defiant in their beauty. George had loved roses. They'd planted them together their first spring, laughing as they got dirt under their nails, and debated over where the sun hit best. One particular bush near the kitchen window always bloomed first. Anna still remembered the look on his face when it did, like witnessing a small miracle. But George had been gone 3 years now. A heart attack. Sudden, unrelenting, and cruel. One moment he was making coffee. The next, she was alone. She lost more than just a husband that day. Since then, the house had become a museum of memory, a quiet tomb lined with framed smiles and ghosts that never left. Her son, David, had stopped visiting soon after the funeral. At first, there were calls, then texts, then nothing. On Christmas, she'd mailed cookies to his son, Eli. Not even a thank you card came in return. She'd told herself he was just busy. Work, kids, the economy. Everyone had a reason to forget. Still, the silence stung like a paper cut you only noticed when the cold set in. Then came the email. "Mom," it began, in that casual, clipped tone David always used when he didn't want to say too much. "Things are a bit tight right now. Lena just got reassigned and my contract ended, so I'm waiting on something new. Eli's schedule is crazy too. If you're thinking about a change in scenery, maybe you could come stay with us for a while, help each other out." Anna read the message 3 times. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't even particularly kind. But there was something about it. A door slightly ajar. A possibility. She imagined herself waking up in a home with noise again. A small hand tugging at hers. Maybe even a real hug from David. The hope was faint, but it glimmered. That same afternoon, she called a real estate agent. "Are you sure?" the young woman asked, flipping through paperwork at Anna's kitchen table. "The market's rough right now. Houses are slow to move. And this place, it's full of character. Your husband left it to you, didn't he?" "He did," Anna said, her voice quiet. "We were married 40 years, but he's not here anymore. And I'm done waiting in this chair." She had savings. Between her pension and the house sale, she'd be more than comfortable. But that wasn't the reason she was going. She wasn't chasing security. She just didn't want to watch the roses bloom alone again. Not this year. When she began packing, she paused in the garden. The bush by the kitchen window was in full bloom. She clipped the brightest rose, its petals rich and open, soft as a whisper. George's favorite. She wrapped the stem in damp paper towel and tucked it carefully between her sweaters. "You're coming with me," she whispered to it. On her final morning in the house, Anna stood at the doorway and looked back one last time. The light fell through the windows just like always, warm and golden. The rocker sat still, unmoved. Dust danced in the air. She didn't cry. She simply closed the door gently behind her, as if saying goodbye to an old friend who had nothing left to say. The airport was cold. Not just the temperature, but the feeling of it. Sterile, loud, filled with faces that didn't glance twice. Anna sat by gate 12 with her purse in her lap, the rose safe in a Ziploc tucked inside her carry-on. She hadn't flown in years. The last time was when Eli was born, when David still sent photos every other week and called her mom without sounding inconvenienced. Back then, she'd bought a tiny stuffed giraffe for Eli. It had gone unopened for months, still in its gift bag when she visited. She told herself this time would be different. Maybe David had changed. Maybe things had softened in the years. After all, people grow, circumstances shift. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a space for her somewhere in his world. She gripped the boarding pass in her hand. Group C. When her section was called, Anna stood slowly, knees stiff. She adjusted the strap of her bag, took one last breath of the only life she'd known for 4 decades and stepped onto the ramp toward something new. She didn't know what was waiting, but she went anyway, with a quiet heart, a cautious hope, and a single rose from a garden no one else remembered how to tend. The first thing Anna noticed was that no one came to pick her up from the airport. David had sent a short text that morning, something about a last-minute meeting and how traffic would be bad anyway. "Just take a cab," he'd written. "I'll text you the code to get in." Anna stood at the curb, her suitcase beside her, as other passengers were greeted with hugs, balloons, and waving children. Her phone buzzed again, a string of numbers. The house code. The taxi ride took almost an hour. The city had changed. Busier, louder, somehow less personal. She stared out the window, heart thudding softly, watching the skyline blur past. She tried to remember the last time she'd hugged David. It had been years. The house was a beige townhouse nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac. Neat, generic. A patchy lawn out front. A white SUV in the driveway. Anna climbed the steps slowly, the cab driver offering a quick nod before pulling away. She rang the bell. Lena opened the door, all polished smiles and clipped syllables. "Hi, Anna. You made it okay?" "I did," Anna said, her voice warm but uncertain. "Come in. Max, sorry Eli is finishing up a virtual class. He'll say hi later." Lena stepped aside, already glancing back at her phone. She wore a tailored navy blazer, hair in a tight bun. Not a wrinkle in sight, not a pause in her step. Inside, the house was tidy but cluttered, an odd mix of adult sterility and child chaos. Toys spilled out of bins near the couch. A stack of dishes sat unwashed in the sink. The scent was a strange blend of laundry detergent, old takeout, and something sweet Anna couldn't quite place. "Your room's downstairs," Lena said, pointing to a narrow staircase. "We cleared out the storage room. It's not much, but you'll manage." Anna offered a smile. "As long as there's a bed." The basement was musty. A small twin mattress sat pushed against the wall next to a worn desk. A single, dust-frosted window let in barely any light. Cardboard boxes still lined the corners. The air was damp, and Anna felt a familiar ache in her knee begin to flare. She placed her bag down and unpacked slowly, careful with the rose. It had wilted a bit during travel, but still held shape. She found a water glass, filled it, and placed the flower on the desk beneath the small window. "We're still together," she whispered. Later that evening, footsteps pattered down the stairs. Eli appeared at the landing. He was taller now, leaner, but his eyes were still the same sharp gray as David's. He looked at Anna like one might look at a substitute teacher. "When are you leaving?" he asked bluntly. Anna blinked. "Excuse me?" "Dad said you're just staying for a little while. You're not living here, right?" he added, nose scrunched as if the very idea offended him. Before Anna could respond, Lena's voice floated down from the kitchen. "Eli, we don't talk like that." "But you said," he started, then mumbled the rest and disappeared back upstairs. Anna stood there for a long moment. Then she closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the clatter of dishes and faint laughter from above. No one called her for dinner. The rose on the desk drooped slightly, its petals curling inward. The next morning, Anna made her way upstairs. Her joints ached. She hadn't slept well. The basement had grown colder overnight. The thin blanket, hardly enough. Her fingers were stiff, her ankles sore. Lena was rushing out the door, phone in one hand, coffee in the other. "Morning, Anna. There's toast in the fridge. I'm running late. Let's catch up tonight." Anna opened her mouth to respond, but Lena was already gone. In the living room, Eli was curled up on the couch, gaming headset on, volume blaring from the TV. Anna approached gently. "Eli, would you like some breakfast?" He didn't look at her. "I want cereal." Anna nodded and began searching the cabinets. She found a half-empty box, poured the cereal, and added milk. As she handed it to him, he said nothing, just slipped the headphones back on and resumed his game. She hovered for a moment, spoon still in hand, unsure whether to sit or retreat. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to her. "Grandma," he said, eyes still on the screen, "can you buy me a new console? The one you got me before is lame. Everyone at school has the new one." Anna hesitated. "Maybe this weekend we can go look at it together." He huffed. "You moved here to spend time with me, right? Then buy it." She didn't reply. Instead, she sat quietly by the kitchen window, the morning light casting dull shadows through the blinds. David didn't come home until almost noon. He looked tired, his hair slightly unkempt. He rifled through the fridge with a kind of detachment. "I can go to the store," Anna offered gently. "Pick up some vegetables. I could cook dinner tonight if you'd like." David shrugged. "Nah, we'll just order something. Lena's working late." That afternoon, the three of them sat around the dining table in silence. Eli tapped on his tablet between bites. Lena scrolled through emails. David stared at a stack of bills without really reading. Suddenly, he spoke. "Mom, the house situation's been tight. Rent, utilities, Eli's school. It's a lot, just a lot right now." Anna looked at him, unsure if that was a statement or a setup. He didn't say more. She nodded, quietly set down her fork, and began clearing the dishes. No one stopped her. No one offered to help. That night, back in the basement, she stared at the rose. Its petals had begun to dry at the tips. The water was cloudy. Anna sat in the dark and listened to the muted thrum of life upstairs. The faint sounds of laughter, the clink of dishes, the kind of warmth that once included her. And for the first time she realized with stunning clarity, she hadn't been invited here because she was loved. She'd been invited because she was convenient. The ache in Anna's knee had returned with a quiet vengeance. The cold basement and the stiff mattress weren't doing her joints any favors. She had forgotten to refill her prescription. Her small plastic pill organizer still sat in the nightstand drawer at her old house. She hadn't thought she'd need it again so soon. She waited until the house was mostly quiet. Eli at school, Lena at work, David still out, and called for a ride share. No fanfare. Just a quick trip to retrieve what was hers. 10 minutes in and out. The townhouse looked the same. The trash bins were still tipped over in the driveway. A child's bicycle lay abandoned in the yard. Anna entered the door code David had sent her and let herself in. Inside, the silence was familiar, but now held a different kind of weight. The air smelled of microwave cheese and stale coffee. She moved quickly down to the basement, not wanting to disturb anyone, though part of her doubted they'd even notice. The nightstand was just as she'd left it. A book with a folded page, a glass half full of cloudy water, and the pill organizer still resting in the corner. She picked it up, pausing for a moment, and felt the faintest tremble in her chest, like she'd just stepped back into a space she no longer belonged to, which she supposed was exactly true. That's when she heard the voices. Footsteps overhead. A door creaked open. David's voice, low and matter-of-fact. "She's going to have to give us something eventually," he said. "Otherwise, we'll never afford to buy this place." Anna froze, one hand still gripping the pill case. Lena answered, her voice quieter. "Do you really think she'd help with the down payment?" "She sold her house, didn't she?" David said. "She's sitting on money. I mean, she's here, we're being nice, right? Just plant the seed. Gently. Let her think it's her idea." There was a long pause. Anna stood still, heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. David continued. We never meant for her to stay this long anyway. It was just to feel things out. But now she's still here, and we've got no reason to ask anymore." Something sharp twisted inside Anna's chest. She didn't recognize the sound her breath made when it left her. A small, quiet rasp, like a bird startled from sleep. She turned, moving slowly, silently. Each step up the stairs felt heavier than the last. She didn't want to make a sound. She didn't want them to know she'd heard. It wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. By the time she reached the front door, her hands had gone cold. Her grip on the pillcase tightened. She didn't look back. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that made everything look a little washed out, a little older. She walked to the edge of the street where her ride had dropped her off. Her driver wasn't due back for another 10 minutes, but she didn't care. She needed the air. She needed distance. She thought of the rose sitting in the basement. Wilted. Brown at the edges, still clinging to the last traces of beauty. Anna exhaled. Not a sob, not a sigh. Just breath. Measured, steady. The betrayal didn't rage through her. It didn't burn. It settled like dust, quiet and inescapable. It had taken years to get here, not just these weeks under David's roof, but years of forgetting herself, of putting everyone else first, of believing that love looked like service. She had confused silence with strength, and now the silence had delivered her the final answer. Back at Ruth's house, the porch light was already on. The familiar scent of rosemary and fresh bread greeted her before she even opened the door. Ruth stood in the kitchen, kneading dough with practiced hands. She looked up, brows furrowed at the sight of Anna standing stiff and pale in the doorway. "You didn't call," Ruth said softly, wiping her hands on a towel. "You okay?" Anna didn't answer right away. She stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, eyes fluttering shut for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm done." Ruth didn't push, just waited. "I went back to get my medicine," Anna continued, "and I heard them." She told Ruth everything, not the dramatic way a wounded woman might, but the way someone tells the truth when they've finally stopped hoping it might change. Ruth listened quietly. She didn't gasp, didn't shake her head in outrage. She just reached over, took Anna's hand, and gave it a squeeze. "I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't deserve that." "I know," Anna said. There was a long silence, not awkward, not heavy, just quiet. Ruth poured tea. The smell of chamomile filled the room. Anna held the cup with both hands and stared into the steam. "I think I knew," she said eventually. "Somewhere deep down I knew. But hearing it, like that, like I was a strategy." She trailed off. Words didn't quite do the ache justice. "You're not a burden," Ruth said gently. "You never were." "You just forgot how to believe that." Anna blinked. Her throat tightened. That night, she didn't sleep in the basement. She slept in the guest room at Ruth's house, where the bed was soft and the air warm, where there were fresh sheets and a lamp with a pink silk shade and a note on the nightstand that simply said, "Welcome back." The next morning, she opened her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her finger hovered for a moment, then tapped. "Hello?" she said softly when the line picked up. "Matthew? It's Anna." There was a pause. Then, "Anna, what a surprise." "I think I'm ready," she said, "for something new." The mornings at Ruth's house were different. They smelled of rosemary and toast, of fresh laundry hung in the sun, of peace. It had only been a few days, but Anna felt something beginning to loosen inside her. The quiet here wasn't heavy like in her old home. It didn't press against her ribs. It just was. Gentle, breathing. Ruth's neighbor, Matthew, lived next door in a cottage smothered in ivy and wild daisies. He was in his 70s, with a stooped back and a laugh that started deep in his chest before reaching his eyes. Most mornings he could be found tending to his tiny herb patch, or reading scripture on his porch, glasses sliding down his nose. They met the first evening Anna arrived. Ruth had taken her out for a walk after dinner, and Matthew had looked up from his book with a smile. "Well now," he said, rising slowly. "This must be your sister." "Anna," Ruth said, introducing them. "Just moved in. Temporarily, maybe?" "Temporarily, permanently, doesn't matter. What matters is you're here." He reached out a hand. His grip was warm, steady. "Welcome." Anna found herself smiling. A real one. Small, but sincere. The next morning he came by with a small jar of homemade jam, fig and lemon, a strange but delightful combination. He wore a cardigan that looked older than Ruth's kitchen and held himself with the kind of kindness that didn't need explanation. "I help lead a small group at the community center," he said as he handed over the jar. "Just a gathering of folks with messy lives and open hearts. Nothing fancy. We share stories, sometimes scripture, mostly tea and honesty. You're welcome to come." He didn't push. He didn't say you should. Just, "You're welcome." Anna didn't answer right away, but that night, as she lay awake in the guest room staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows above her, she thought about the word welcome. How long had it been since she'd felt that without strings attached? So the next Wednesday morning, she went. The room was modest, just a circle of chairs in the sunroom of the community center. There were about a dozen people, all different ages. Some held coffee mugs. One woman had a sleeping baby curled in her lap. The man leading the group was soft-spoken, maybe in his 40s, and wore jeans with paint splatters on the knees. "Today's verse," he began, "is one that carried me through some of my hardest days." He held up a small, worn Bible, pages feathered and annotated. "Psalm 126, verse 5, he said. "Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy." There was a hush. Anna's breath caught. The words sank through her like sunlight cutting through fog. "Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy." He went on, sharing a story about his brother's addiction, the nights he spent crying on the floor, the years it took for healing to begin. But Anna wasn't listening to his story anymore. She was somewhere else. She was standing by her rose bush, hands in the dirt, tears falling unnoticed into the soil as George's laughter echoed in memory. She was watching David graduate from college, sending him money she barely had, writing letters that were never answered. She was standing at Lena's front door, suitcase in hand, still hoping. She had sown in tears for years. Quietly, without thanks, without pause. And still, somehow, she was standing. She didn't speak in the group, just sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. But when the session ended, and Matthew walked over with a gentle smile, she nodded once. "Thank you for inviting me." "I didn't," he said with a wink. "The invitation came from someone higher. I just delivered it." That night, Anna couldn't sleep. Not because she was anxious, but because something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She felt like she was becoming visible again, even if just to herself. She stood by the guest room window, looking out at Ruth's garden. A breeze carried the scent of sage and early summer. In the moonlight, the leaves shimmered silver. She thought back to the psalm, "Sow in tears, reap in joy." She'd spent decades giving, planting, hoping, not out of obligation but out of love. And while her family had grown blind to her presence, her value hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting. She remembered every moment David hadn't shown up, hadn't called, hadn't seen her, and yet she'd still sent gifts, still baked cookies, still clipped roses. Not because she was weak, but because that was who she was. And maybe that was okay. She didn't need to be different. She didn't need to become hardened to earn respect. She just needed to remember her love had worth, even when unreturned. The next morning, she woke up early, for once, without pain. She made tea for Ruth and packed a small basket with muffins. Then she stepped out into the garden with pruning shears in hand. She clipped 3 small roses, not the biggest, not the boldest, but the ones blooming quietly near the edges. She placed them in a vase on the kitchen table, right next to Matthew's jam. When Ruth walked in, hair still messy from sleep, she paused and smiled. "Those from your old bush?" she asked. Anna shook her head. "New garden, new light." And for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. She felt like a woman who had finally begun to come home to herself. Anna didn't tell Ruth right away. The decision came like a quiet current, slow at first, then steady, undeniable. It didn't rush in like rage or strike like vengeance. It was calm, like a river finally carving its own path after years of erosion. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even surprised. She had passed through that tunnel of emotion in silence, emerging on the other side not wounded, but awake. It happened a few mornings after the small group meeting. Anna sat at Ruth's kitchen table, sipping tea from a chipped blue mug. The roses she'd clipped still sat in the vase nearby, beginning to open more fully. Outside, the garden bathed in gold. Ruth had gone to the market. The house was quiet. Anna pulled out her phone. The name of the real estate agent from the pamphlet David had once left on the table came to her mind. She looked it up, called the office. A woman answered, brisk, efficient. "Yes," she said. "The property's still available. The owners are relocating to Florida, very motivated to sell. There's been interest, but nothing finalized yet. Are you connected to the tenants?" Anna hesitated. Then, voice steady, "I'd like to make an offer. Cash." There was a pause. Then, "Cash always speaks louder. We can begin paperwork today." After the call, Anna didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat still, letting the weight of the choice settle. It wasn't about punishing David and Lena. It wasn't even about reclaiming the space. It was about ending the story the way she chose, not the way they wrote it for her. She called Ruth next. "Can you come home a little early?" she asked softly. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Anna said. "Just need you to sit with me. I'm about to do something, and I want you there." 20 minutes later, Ruth walked in, slightly breathless, 2 paper bags of groceries in hand. Anna met her at the door. "I'm buying the house," she said. Ruth blinked. "Your old house?" Anna shook her head. "David's." Ruth said nothing at first, then slowly, "To get back at them?" Anna's answer was simple. "No, to stop being used." Ruth set the bags down, the air thick with emotion. She crossed the room and took Anna's hand. "I'll sit with you," she said, "all the way through." Then Anna called Matthew. She didn't need advice. She didn't need permission, but she did need prayer. He picked up on the second ring. "Matthew, it's Anna. I'm making a big move. I just want someone to pray over it with me." "Of course," he said gently, not asking what or why. "Right now?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate. "Lord," he said, voice soft, "sure, thank you for Anna, for the courage you've stirred in her heart. Thank you that she's choosing dignity, not bitterness. Guide her next steps. Let this be a door she walks through with peace, not pride, and remind her, always, of her worth. Amen." Anna closed her eyes, the prayer sinking into her like roots into soil. "Thank you," she whispered. Then quietly she and Ruth drove to the real estate office. The building was modern, all glass and metal, but the conference room was cozy. A young woman in a blazer greeted them. The documents were already printed. "The sellers are relieved," she said. "You're the ideal buyer. Quick, clear, no drama." Anna gave a small smile. If only you knew, she thought. She signed page after page, each signature more confident than the last. With every stroke of ink she felt something lift, like shedding an old coat that no longer fit. She wasn't erasing David or trying to teach him a lesson. She was drawing a boundary, clear, kind, immovable. By the time the final page was signed, her heart was steady. Not light, not heavy, just right. Ruth looked over and reached across the table. "How do you feel?" Anna exhaled. "Like I just made space in my life where self-worth can breathe again." They stepped outside into the warm afternoon air. The breeze smelled of lemon trees and asphalt and the faintest hint of lavender. Anna turned her face to the sun and closed her eyes. The past no longer clung, the future no longer frightened. She was, for the first time in years, entirely in the present. And it was enough. It was a Saturday morning when the real estate agent called. "We're scheduling the property inspection for the buyer," she said. "The current tenants have been notified." Anna's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table. "Do they know who's buying it?" "No," the agent replied. "We keep buyer identity confidential unless requested otherwise." "Good," Anna said, her voice even. "Let's keep it that way, for now." Ruth insisted on going with her. "You don't have to face that alone," she'd said firmly, hand already reaching for her purse. And Anna didn't argue. Not this time. They waited just outside the neighborhood gate in Ruth's car. The air smelled of cut grass and anticipation. When the agent arrived, sharp, professional, and unsentimental, they followed behind her slowly up the familiar curve of the cul-de-sac. Anna's heart didn't race. She wasn't nervous. There was no revenge in her blood, no desire to see David squirm. She had already reclaimed what mattered, herself. The townhouse looked just as it had the first time she arrived. Beige siding, patchy lawn, white SUV still perfectly parked in front. But this time she was not a guest. She was the owner. The agent entered first. Anna stood at the doorstep a beat longer, inhaling once, deep and full. When she stepped inside, the memories hit her. Not like ghosts, but like echoes. Distant, dull, no longer hers. David was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyebrows drawn tight. Lena sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine that had long since lost her interest. Their heads turned when they saw her. "Mom?" David's voice cracked slightly. What are you doing here?" Anna didn't answer him. She turned to the agent. "I'd like to check the basement first," she said calmly. "Last time I visited, the ventilation was concerning." The agent nodded. "Of course. We're just confirming the disclosures today." Lena stood up, her face pale. "Wait, buyer? What do you mean buyer?" The room fell into a stunned silence. David's gaze snapped back to Anna. He took a step forward. You're the buyer?" Only then did she meet his eyes. Her expression was soft, unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. "The house now belongs to me." He blinked. Why would you?" "That day I came to get my medication," Anna said, cutting gently through his panic. "I heard you talking. I wasn't hiding, I was just present. You didn't care whether I heard or not." David's face tightened. "You were eavesdropping?" "It wasn't eavesdropping," Anna said. "You said, and I quote, 'She's going to have to give us something eventually.'" She gave a soft, almost sad smile. "So I decided to give you something after all. Clarity?" Lena looked away. David's voice dropped. "So, this is what? Punishment?" Anna shook her head. "No, David. I'm not here to take anything back. I'm here to remind myself that I have every right to a place where I'm not treated like an afterthought." He opened his mouth, but she continued, voice steady. "I had planned to help you. After I sold my house, I thought I might offer some of what I had left. I thought foolishly, perhaps, that I could help you build something stable, but then I heard what you said, and I understood." She paused. "I wasn't your mother in that house. I was your leverage, your backup plan." David stepped back, arms loosening at his sides. "We were under pressure. It wasn't personal." "That's the problem," Anna said. "It should have been." Lena didn't say a word. She stood beside David, lips pressed tightly together, The agent cleared her throat. "Shall we proceed?" Anna turned to her. "Actually, there's no need for a full tour today. Everything's just as I remember." She walked toward the front door, Ruth following a few paces behind. At the threshold, she turned once more. "The lease gives you 1 more month," Anna said evenly. "I won't reclaim the space before then. No need to panic. Just remember, this place no longer belongs to someone who sees you as a means to an end." She didn't wait for a reply. Outside, the breeze had picked up. The air felt lighter, like someone had cracked open a window in her chest and let the years of dust blow out. They walked in silence to the car. Ruth opened the passenger door but paused before getting in. "You okay?" Anna nodded, not with bravado, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally returned to herself. "For the first time," she said, "I feel like me. Not because someone told me I mattered, but because I finally believed I do." Ruth smiled. "Took you long enough." Anna smiled back. And in that moment, no longer waiting to be loved, no longer measuring her worth by anyone's approval, she was free. It was late afternoon when the knock came. Anna was in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough, flour clinging to her fingers like second skin. The scent of cinnamon filled the room. She and Ruth were experimenting with an old pie recipe, half tradition, half guessing. Ruth wiped her hands and went to the door. There was a pause. Then she called gently, "Anna?" Anna looked up. Ruth's face told her everything before the words did. "It's David." Anna slowly washed her hands, dried them with the towel that still smelled of lemon soap, and walked to the front door. David stood there on the porch. No gift, no rehearsed smile. Just David, tired, awkward, older than she remembered. "Hi, Mom," she nodded. "David." For a moment, they stood without speaking. Then Ruth, ever graceful, stepped aside. "I'll let you two talk." Anna led him to the living room. She didn't offer him tea, didn't tell him to sit, but he did anyway, carefully, like a guest unsure of his welcome. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in," he said quietly. "I didn't," Anna replied. "Ruth did." He nodded, accepting that. "I've been thinking," he said, "a lot. About everything." Anna didn't respond. She sat across from him, hands folded gently in her lap. "I know what I said, what you heard. It wasn't right, and I'm not here to excuse it." Still, she said nothing. "I used you," he admitted, eyes low. "I saw your savings as a solution, not as part of you, not as something earned. I just thought, maybe you'd help, like always." He looked up at her then, his voice quieter. "I'm sorry." Anna held his gaze. There was no fire in her eyes, no accusation, only something that resembled calm. "You don't need to apologize to be forgiven," she said at last. David blinked. "I don't?" She shook her head. "Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me. I needed to let go of what you did so it wouldn't sit like rot inside me. So I did." David swallowed, unsure what to say. "But if you want to change," she continued, "then don't just say sorry. Live differently. That's the only apology that matters." He nodded slowly, his hands twisted in his lap. "I'm trying," he said. "Not just for you. For Eli, too. I don't want him to grow up thinking people are only useful if they give him things." "That would be a start," Anna said. "Teach him gratitude. Teach him presence. Teach him to call someone just because he misses them." David looked down. "I didn't come to ask for anything, just to see you, to let you know I'm trying." She nodded once. That was enough. There were no hugs, no dramatic music, just two people sitting in a quiet room, years of missteps laid between them like scattered bricks. But some bricks, Anna thought, can be reused, if you're careful enough. They sat for a few minutes longer, talking softly about little things. David asked about the community center. Anna mentioned she was leading a craft session next week. He smiled at that, said he remembered how she used to make paper animals for his science projects. When he stood to leave, he lingered by the door. "Would it be okay," he asked, "if Eli sent you something?" Anna raised an eyebrow. "He drew something," David said, "all on his own. Said he wanted to." Anna tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" David pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "He asked me to give this to you." She took it. The paper was slightly crumpled, colored with bright crayon strokes. It showed a garden, simple and messy, stick figure flowers, a giant sun, and a white-haired woman kneeling beside a bush with a watering can. Above it, in careful, uneven letters, "Grandma Anna planting flowers. I miss your cookies." Anna traced her fingers along the drawing. Something in her chest fluttered. Not pain, not joy, just a flicker of warmth. "Children," she said softly, "still have time." David opened the door. "I'll let you be," he said. Anna didn't say goodbye, but just before he stepped off the porch, she called out, "David!" He turned. "I'm not angry anymore." He nodded. His eyes said what words couldn't. Then he left. Back inside, Ruth looked up from the kitchen table, her face expectant. Anna held up the drawing. "It's from Eli." Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that had seen the world and still believed in its redemption. Anna placed the drawing on the mantel, next to the small vase of dried roses. A few days later, she wrote Eli a card. Just one line. "Next time you visit, I'll teach you how to plant marigolds. They bloom fast, but they're strong." And as she pressed the stamp onto the envelope, she thought, maybe hearts, like flowers, just need the right kind of light to grow back. It took Anna nearly a month after David moved out to fully step into the house that was now hers. When the lease ended, the keys were left in the mailbox, and a quiet email from the agent confirmed that the tenants had vacated. No note, no questions, just absence. She stood at the front door, hand on the knob, breathing in the stillness before stepping inside. The air had changed. Gone were the smells of someone else's dinners, someone else's rush, someone else's noise. The walls were bare again. The house felt empty, but not in a lonely way. It felt like a blank page. Anna walked through each room slowly, her footsteps echoing softly across the hardwood. The basement still smelled faintly of dust and old carpet, but the heaviness had lifted. She opened every window and let the air rush in. Then she began. She replaced the curtains, light linen, pale blue like the sky on a gentle day. She had the walls painted a warm, creamy beige that made the morning sun linger longer. The cold leather sofa was replaced with a second-hand couch she found at a local shop, soft, cloud-colored, with just the right amount of sink. She didn't buy expensive things, just pieces that made her feel like she belonged there. In the kitchen, the only thing that stayed the same was the bottle of olive oil she had once brought with her. She cleaned it, set it near the stove, and whispered, "Now you're home." The basement, once her exile, was transformed into her little sanctuary. She turned it into a workshop and memory room. Shelves for her crafting tools, a table for writing, bins filled with fabric scraps and photo boxes. She even installed a small climate control unit so the air would never again sting her bones. And in the narrow windowsill, she planted new roses. Not from her old garden, not from Ruth's yard. These were new, delicate pinks and soft whites, almost translucent in the sun. A different kind of bloom, a different kind of beginning. She made a sign from reclaimed wood, carefully sanding and painting it by hand. When it was done, she nailed it above the front porch. "Anna's house, welcome." Not for guests, not for show, for herself. Every Thursday, Anna volunteered at the local church's after-school program. She taught the kids how to make bookmarks, felt animals, and paper lanterns. Their laughter filled the air like a song she hadn't heard in years. They called her Miss Anna and argued over who got to sit next to her. One girl told her, "You smell like cinnamon and glue sticks." Anna laughed until she cried. She no longer waited for David to call, or for someone to tell her she was needed. She simply gave what she had without shrinking, without expectation. It wasn't about being useful anymore. It was about being alive. On quiet mornings, she'd sit in her new kitchen with a cup of black tea and write postcards, sometimes to old friends, sometimes to no one in particular, and sometimes to Eli. One arrived in the mail just after the roses began blooming again. Inside was a simple sketch of her house, drawn in green and blue crayon with tiny stick roses under the window and a bird in the sky. He'd written, in crooked handwriting, "Can I come plant flowers with you this summer?" She smiled and pinned the drawing to her fridge, next to a photo of her and Ruth at the community center, holding up matching tote bags they'd made from old jeans. Then she picked up a blank card and began to write. Her pen moved slowly, with care. "Next time you visit, I'll teach you how to bake bread. That's how I learned to love life again. One need, one breath, one slice at a time." She sealed it with a press of her thumb. Outside, a soft wind moved through the rose bushes. One bloom had just opened, fresh and delicate, petals unfolding like a whispered yes. Anna stepped out to clip it. She held it for a moment, watching the light catch its edges. Then she placed it in the vase by the window, right next to a card from Eli, a pine cone from the craft center, and the tiny giraffe toy she had once packed for a boy who didn't remember it. She didn't need to be remembered anymore, because she remembered herself.